Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Zara Seidler.
I'm Emma Gillespie.
We are going straight into a big topic. We're not starting small. We're going into a big news topic that I have watched across the headlines over the last couple of weeks. And that culminated yesterday when the New South Wales Government announced it would amend existing laws to ban public displays of Nazi ideology. Now, we need to rewind a bit to understand how we got here, but it is basically come after a group of neo-Nazis held an antisemitic rally outside New South Wales Parliament a few weeks ago. In today's podcast, Em, we are going to explain what happened on that Sunday morning a few weeks back, what the fallout has been, and how the New South Wales Government has now responded.
Zara, as you mentioned, this is a story that has been developing for a few weeks now.
Yeah.
The context of it goes back several years even, but I think a good place to start is probably that actual event that you mentioned that neo-Nazis held outside New South Wales Parliament on the 8th of November, because everything that's unfolded since is essentially because of what happened that day.
Exactly.
So can you take us through it?
Yeah, so I remember we were all texting on a group WhatsApp that morning saying, oh my goodness, there is this image that has gone viral of essentially 60 men all dressed in black standing outside New South Wales Parliament, so just up the road from where we are now.
Yeah.
And that was a protest that was organised by a neo-Nazi group called the National Socialist Network. And what had happened essentially was that group organised to hold that protest outside Parliament. They were standing there all in black, some of them wearing sunglasses, others masked, but many of whom were identifiable. And they were standing with a sign in front of them that said, "Abolish the Jewish lobby." Now, the Sydney Morning Herald was there at the time, and so we do have quite a lot of vision of what actually happened that day. But we also understand that the group chanted the slogan, "Blood and Honour," which we know is a chant closely associated with Hitler Youth. The protest lasted about 20 minutes, just to give you a sense of the length of it. It was really, really short. I saw one journalist refer to it as a made-for-social media protest, and I think that really perfectly encapsulates it, because it was kind of this very inflammatory photo that immediately went viral and got the whole country talking.
Yeah, it was not one of those protests that you see with masses of thousands of people marching through the city. It really did feel like a very 2025 kind of a protest. So it's a Sunday morning. We have these 60 or so men holding up deeply offensive signs, chanting Nazi slogans. I think sometimes we see these groups try to be maybe a little bit more subtle in their approach, if I can say that, but there was no denying it here. Immediately, there were questions from the community circulating online about how this was allowed to go ahead, right?
Yeah, exactly. That was almost straight away. So if at 10 a.m. these images started circulating, I'd say within the half hour, there were questions being directed to both the police commissioner and later to the New South Wales Premier about how on earth this had actually happened in the first place.
Did authorities know this was going to happen?
Yeah, well, this is the interesting thing. So police did know it was going to happen. Not the police commissioner, and I'll get back to that in a moment, but police knew it was happening because they received a notice of intention to hold a public assembly. It's just a whole lot of words to say the group applied to protest.
Yep.
And that intention was made clear on the 28th of October, so days before it was held. The notice of intention was filed by a group called White Australia, so per your previous comment about not obscuring what we're talking about here, and they made what they wanted to do really clear. I won't go into the specifics of how the actual process of applying to protest works, because I know that you guys covered that in the pod a little while back. It's nice to, have these threads throughout the podcast. But essentially, police did not object to the application to hold this protest, and so it was allowed to occur. So it wasn't necessarily that they ticked and it was approved that way, but because they didn't object to it and it therefore didn't make it to the courts, it meant that they were allowed to proceed.
Okay.
The police commissioner, though, as I just said earlier, didn't know the protest was taking place. He said that was because of a communication error internally within the police force. And because he didn't know about it, he said he obviously couldn't tell the New South Wales government about it. And so they didn't know about it either.
Interesting. I wonder if because of the smaller scale of this protest, if it slipped under the radar in some way. We know when there are thousands of people expected to attend a protest that requires, streets to be shut down, extra police to be on duty, safety precautions and the likes thereof. So I wonder if it just sort of slipped through the cracks.
Well, yeah, every other time we've spoken about a protest on this podcast, we've been talking about tens of thousands of people and public safety and everything that comes with that. But you're right, this was obviously a much smaller scale, but there were still rightly questions about how it was allowed to proceed.
And we know it proceeded despite the scale, that it dominated headlines a few weeks ago and in the days since. Both the government and police were questioned by journalists on many occasions about how this was allowed to go ahead. And then this week, the attention really turned to who the men in that protest actually were, because like you mentioned, Zara, many of them were visibly identifiable.
Hello, my name's Sam. I'm the co-founder of TDA. I'm just popping in to interrupt this video to ask if you could do one thing for me, and that is press subscribe on this YouTube channel. It's the best way to show us that you love what we do and that you're here for our future. And now, back to the deep dive.
Yeah, I do want to shout out just some excellent journalism that I've seen here, because so much of the work that has gone into identifying who these men were done by journalists who either attended or have been able to identify these men based on things like a bracelet. So, yeah, and then being able to verify it against other photos. So there's been some really incredible journalism done in the last couple of days. But as you said, we have now got a fuller picture of who was actually in attendance, who those 60 men actually were. And look, they include people like an engineer, a teacher, an employee of Australia Post. These are, men who are working everyday jobs who have then on the weekend gone and protested in this neo-Nazi rally. I do want to focus on one of the men. He has really dominated the headlines. His name is Matthew Gruter. Now, based on the ABC's reporting, we've learnt that Gruter attended the rally and that he was wearing, I said before, that bracelet. He was wearing a bracelet engraved with blood and honour. Again, that's the Nazi slogan. The reason there's been so much interest in Gruter specifically is because he's actually a South African national. He is not an Australian citizen and he is in this country on a visa. And since he was identified by media and organisations working to help identify who was there, he has since had his visa revoked and he will be deported from this country.
So, Zara, we've got Matthew Gruter. He was identified by that bracelet, the incredible journalism at the Sydney Morning Herald that unearthed that. Then his visa was cancelled. I'm assuming that was a decision by the immigration department. We've had a few kind of high profile visa stories lately. Tony Burke's been very busy.
He has, and it was Tony Burke who announced the decision this week. I do want to read out something he said. He said, "We've got a really strong principle here. If you're on a visa, you are a guest in Australia. If someone turns up for the purposes of just abusing people and wrecking the place and damaging the cohesion, you can ask them to leave." That is exactly what Tony Burke and the immigration department has asked of Matthew Gruter. There was an immigration raid. It was like a 7 a.m. very early morning immigration raid after he was identified, and he was detained. He is now at Villawood Detention Centre, where he is awaiting deportation, which Burke says he expects will happen very soon.
Wow. So this South African national is essentially in federal custody, awaiting deportation. So just to recap, Zara, we had at the beginning of the month this rally held by neo-Nazis outside New South Wales Parliament. Police knew it was going to happen, although the police commissioner did not. Since then, people who attended the rallies have been identified. We know many of them are quote unquote everyday people in the community working everyday jobs. One of them is facing deportation. Has the government responded to all of this? What has been said at that level?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And we got the, fullest answer yesterday in the form of legislation from the New South Wales government. So they announced on Wednesday that they were going to introduce amendments to the Crimes Act that would crack down on public displays of Nazi ideology by giving police and courts greater powers. Mm-hmm. Now, just to be clear, Nazi symbols, things like the swastika, for example, are already banned in New South Wales. You cannot be publicly displaying that. But these changes will target the actions that we saw specifically at that rally outside Parliament.
Right. So it's about where you protest and where these messages are broadcast.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's going into it, but it's also what was being said. So, a swastika is imagery, for example, but these men were chanting, and so it's really doubling down on things like that. So chants and slogans, the kind of Nazi rhetoric that we were talking about, blood and honor.
Yeah.
This is really targeting that sort of thing.
Got it. So those like emblems, the swastika, the imagery, I guess this is a little bit of a loophole that has existed since that crackdown, which the New South Wales crackdown triggered a national crackdown. That's a symbol that is now federally outlawed.
You're exactly right. They specifically, the New South Wales government specifically said they've already, made actions in this space, but clearly there is a need to strengthen the laws, and that's what this is trying to do.
Got it.
So just to talk about what would happen in the instance where, this rally were to go ahead again, anyone who engages in the conduct, which includes, as we just said, using Nazi chants or slogans in public, would face up to a year in prison or a maximum fine of $11,000. Now, you referred just then, Em, to the location when somebody is, using this sort of slogan or chant. And this legislation really zeroes in on that because it says those penalties will increase if the offence is committed near a synagogue, so a Jewish place of worship, or a Jewish school or the Jewish Museum, which is a Holocaust museum here in Sydney. In that instance, the offender would be facing up to 2 years imprisonment or a $22,000 fine. So we're exactly doubling in the instance that this is happening near a Jewish landmark, as it were.
You mentioned police powers changing as well under this New South Wales legislation.
Yeah.
What's the update there?
Yeah, so the amendment would also give police new powers to order an offender to take down the suspected Nazi symbol, so something like that sign that we saw outside Parliament. In announcing the, new laws, New South Wales Attorney General said, the deplorable stunt we saw outside New South Wales Parliament has no place in our society. Nobody should be subject to this vile hatred because of their background or faith. We are giving police and the courts additional powers to hold Nazi extremists to account for their abhorrent views. Very clear language being used there from the New South Wales government. And so, just to finish off this law, just in terms of the process from here, it's been sent to a committee. Legislation often is. So a committee will have a look at it, see if there are any concerns with it, give some recommendations. Then it will be back to the House to be voted on, and we will absolutely keep our listeners updated as to where that legislation ends up.
A really important and fascinating story, Zara. Thank you for making sense of all of that for us, and it's so nice to have you back.
So good to be back, Em.
And thank you for listening to this episode of The Daily Aus. We'll be back a little later on today with your evening news headlines, but until then, have a great day.